Hey, everybody. John Sherwood here with the Unpolished podcast. Thanks again for joining us. Please like and subscribe, rate and review. Drop comments below of anything that you would like for us to discuss on the show or questions that you might have. We're looking forward to the Unpolished community continuing to grow as God leads and guides. Today, I've got the great opportunity to talk with some friends of mine, John and Wes, who are actually pastors in a church that merged with an existing church. They acquired a building that was 120 years old. Then they got the revelation from Jesus that he wanted them to sell the building and move into microchurch expressions. And so today we're going to unpack all of that with them, hear about their journey, hear about their story, and hopefully you can glean something along the way as well as God is leading you and your community as you follow Jesus. Let's jump in. John and Wes, great to have you here. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Hey, man. Good to be here.
It's a pleasure.
So I get to have the great privilege of having you guys on this Unpolished show and hearing a little bit about your journey. You guys were a part of a traditional church and on staff there and leading the church. And then you got the crazy cockamamie idea to venture into the microchurch world. And so we hope to be able to just unpack that a little bit today, hear a little bit about your story, how that all happened, why that happened, what you've learned since then, what you might go back and redo differently if you had the opportunity, and some of your hopes going forward. I know there's going to be lots of glances on, the mistakes that we wish we could redo. Just super excited, man. So just jump in anywhere you want. Just give us a little backdrop of like where you started and kind of what led you in the direction of microchurches in the very beginning.
Good times. I think we should probably just start at January 2016. Wes and I were part of a church plant in the neighborhood, in a challenging neighborhood in Roanoke. And we're having some fun with that. Another local church approached us, a more traditional church approached us and just said, hey, what would it look like for you guys to partner up with us? Because we've got this giant building, not a lot of people, and we can't keep up anymore. And we said, nah, we don't want to do that. But then the Lord ultimately had other plans. And we wound up on a retreat with our leadership team. We wound up saying yes to the Lord on that. And we kind of shacked up with that church for a little while, moved into the building in 2015. And then in 2015, actually had a vote to merge together. I became the lead pastor of that church, and we went on a really cool revitalization journey. Just revitalizing that church, saw the Lord do some cool things there, and brought some different generations together. We had folks from Belmont who were in their 80s and 90s, and folks from our church were typically on the much younger scale. And kind of bringing those two worlds together was fun to navigate, sometimes tough, as people had different expectations for what was going to happen. And we got a chance to do that together, really, to partner up, to see what the Lord would do. He did some exciting things, and we did that, faithfully for 4 years until COVID hit. And then we gave up. No, just kidding.
we threw in the towel and said, bag this.
Right.
COVID's too much.
Yeah. It was sometime in 2020, actually, where through a different series of events, the Lord made it clear to us that he wanted us to sell that 50,000 square foot church building. So through some different prayer times, through elders meetings, through congregational conversations, and church votes that turned out to be unanimous, which was an amazing thing.
When does that ever happen in church? A unanimous anything?
It doesn't happen. So we were like, man, we're taking that as a sign that we're moving.
That has to be the Lord.
That 100%. So we we've never doubted that. I would say it's safe to say we've never doubted that the Lord was calling us to do that. The congregation felt good about it. Although there had been a lot of memories made there, for the last 100 years, 120 years, really.
Wow.
And folks were like, you know what? It's just too much. So
Now, just out of curiosity, what happened to the building? What happened when you sold it? What did it become?
It's now called Belmont Lofts. And so it became some much needed housing in the neighborhood.
Oh,
so it had a really huge Sunday school wing. So we wound up, we never even actually hired a realtor. We just said, if this is of God, we don't want to have to do a lot of work on this. So we just reached out to a few folks, and a lot of people came and looked at the building and said, we wouldn't take this building if you gave it to us for free. So we were like, oh man, this is not going well. But then we had a gentleman show up that kind of fell in love with the space and just said, you know what, this is a really neat space. And he had a vision for what it could become. And the neighborhood needed some new housing, and he was a developer. And so he took it and just recently actually opened it up. It took a couple of years to do all the work that he needed to do to it. And opened it up, and now people are living there in that space. The sanctuary is still virtually untouched, but the rest of the building has been turned into some really cool apartments.
Wow.
So yeah.
That's cool to see that kind of repurposed space and land, walls for the glory of God and the betterment of human beings. That's really neat. I don't know how many churches are getting remodeled into something else, but I gotta imagine it's more than it was 50 years ago, right? And so that's cool. That's cool.
Yeah.
So COVID hit.
We felt good about it, and we felt like we were being obedient in that. But a short time after that, during the time that was happening, I was at a pastor's lunch, with like traditional churches. And I sat down, and one of the pastors didn't know who I was. And I forget how it came up, but he's like, just talking about how churches in the area were declining. And he's like, yeah, did you hear about this one church? They actually
they sold the building.
Oh
yeah. You're like, yeah, can you believe that guy?
Before he put himself out there too far, I was like, I interrupted and I was like, actually, I think you're talking about me. And he's like, oh, right. Great. Tell me all about
it. Oh, I'm sure that was of the Lord.
Yeah. But he was like setting me up to shoot me down. And I tried to help him save face by jumping in there and going, hey, before you cast stones at that guy was me.
Right. That's great. That's so classic. So COVID hits, you guys decide to sell the building. What comes next in the journey?
Yeah.
Gosh. So really part of that journey was a lot of prayers, as John said, and we were praying about how we could be more intentional with our community, with discipleship, with bringing people to know Jesus. And interestingly enough, at an elders meeting, we went away as the elders and kind of to our corners to just pray for the night and just seek the Lord on what it means now that we've talked about selling the building, and really just giving the space to God to be able to tell us what he needed, what he wanted. And we came back again unanimously as elders and said we all were feeling like we needed a more intentional model of quote unquote doing church. We all came back saying we wanted to have a greater focus on discipleship, on men in the church, on families. And so the conversation started to become, how do we do that? What does that look like? And everybody had some semblance of or version of microchurch in their minds. Mm-hmm. And so out of that really birthed conversations and more prayer and really saying, hey, well, if we're letting go of the building, this is probably a prime opportunity to also change how we're doing church. Mm-hmm. And we didn't want it to actually be because of COVID. Like, we didn't want this to be a response to COVID.
Yeah.
We didn't want it to be a response to what's happening in the world or with the government or overseas. We really wanted it to be a response to what God was calling us to do. And so from there, gosh, I don't even know where to take it from there. I mean,
so let me ask a question. So like, where did you said that it kind of was this unanimous sort of vibe about turning towards a model that could greater emphasize and be more conducive for disciple making and disciple formation. Mm-hmm. And there was a sense of like house church, small church, micro churches from everybody. Where did that come from? Like, where do you think, was it just like a divine revelation from the Lord, or was there something that had like exposed you guys prior to some sort of house church thing? Like where do you think that came from?
Honestly, it was a divine revelation. None of us had ever, that I remember, talked about house church, micro church, smaller churches. It was really just, again, truly, we were praying, and everybody didn't come back calling it micro church, but we all were.
We didn't even have that wording yet.
Yeah, we didn't.
Right.
But it was clear that we needed something more intentional, because, as many churches will agree, most of the development of the folks in your churches happens in a small group setting, one-on-one, one-on-three, when you can really get to the nitty-gritty of what's actually happening in people's hearts and minds. Mm-hmm. And so with that kind of at the forefront, and this divine revelation from God, we just kept marching forward with that, saying, okay, God, we hear you. Now, what does the outpouring of that look like practically?
Yeah.
So where did the microchurch term, and like, how did that start to form? Like, as you come away with this sense, like, and you said we didn't even have the language of microchurch yet. How did that sort of get added on to the lattice?
I would say, I mean, it's been a while back now, but I would say probably leaving that meeting, I was the least on board with that plan. Like, everybody was talking.
You heard from the Lord the least.
I'm like, hey, we're obeying the Lord to sell the building. But,
that's one step at a time here, guys.
I mean, doesn't that mean a smaller building? So it turned out to be much smaller, houses. So I think it came just from just us leaving there and then pursuing that. Like, we actually put it in one of our church votes that we're going to ask the congregation for their blessing to pursue the sale of the building, just tentatively. And then also to pursue the smaller version of the church. And, and we put it in the wording of the vote, like, we don't know what that looks like, but we want your blessing before we start going down that road to pursue that. And then, I think basically it was just one quick Google search, and we're like, okay, we know what we're doing. Just kidding.
Right. Yeah. Well, this is a really well-worn path out there.
Part of it too, John, I think, was not wanting, if we were going to do this, trying to do something maybe a bit different with the thought, prayers, hopes of attracting non-believers or unchurched folks in our community. So many people, when you say church today, quickly probably have some stigma with it or stereotype. And so I think some of that initial research or conversation around what should we call this was, what is something that would interest people who don't know Jesus or who are unchurched, and maybe help them overcome those initial kind of barriers. If I say, well, I'm Belmont Church and, we're from a particular denomination, you're all in most cases, you're already off to the races with what they may be perceived about you, real or not.
Yeah.
Right.
So we, one of our next steps was to put together a team that we called our new wine team. So basically we were just like, if, we're selling this building and we're going to be operating in a new wineskin, if you will, that we put that team together and met over the course of the next year or so, and just met and put everything on the table, and just said, hey, we're starting from ground zero. So what could this look like? What would this look like? And that led to, some good times together, some disagreements together. But that helped us to kind of form at least what we thought we were doing. It's easy to sit in a living room somewhere and map out all the things that you're going to do. And then especially as the former pastor of a traditional church, like, hey, I've got it all figured out in a conference room. Now I know exactly how it's going to play out. And then what we've learned since then, the implementation, we learned a whole lot more. We actually learned that we had a lot of unlearning to do because we unknowingly were just trying to implement or usher in these things the way that we'd always done them. And we actually had to try and fail or question ourselves to go, well, why are we doing it like this? This is the way we've always done it. But that's just because we inherited that model or that way of thinking. How could we think about this better, and more like missionaries in our context instead of just doing church as normal? So
it's like Mike Tyson said, right? That everybody has a plan till they get punched in the mouth. Yeah. Every church pastor has a plan and a strategy for church in the conference room. And then it goes out in the streets. It's like, well, all right. So I know for me, the first time I ever heard the term microchurch was from a church that my mom actually attended in Florida. She took me to church with her when I was down there visiting. And this was probably 10 or 15 years ago. And that church was like a traditional, like attractional model church on Sundays with like multiple campuses. But then their small group structures, they called microchurches. And I was like, what the heck is a microchurch? And in their like kind of modality, it was essentially them really trying to emphasize their small groups and that these microchurches were kind of missionally based, right? It wasn't just for groups of smaller numbers of people that are already in the church, but groups of people in the church actually trying to go and be the salt of the earth in the community, right? And I was like, wow, I like that idea. And then later on, I stumbled across several other people and groups and kind of movements that were doing similar things, 3DM in Europe, and then Tampa Underground down in Tampa. And I've come to find out that the guy who started Tampa, Brian Sanders, is like childhood best friends with the guy who leads the church in Gainesville, Florida, where I first heard the term microchurch. And I didn't find out until 10 years later that, like there's some of these connections being made. But for me, it was just born out of this growing, whatever the word is, like dissatisfaction, frustration, discontentment with the lack of what I perceive to be the formation of Jesus in people's lives, right? And I've shared this story on other episodes, but I don't think I've shared it with you guys. For me, one of the catalytic moments was I was on staff. I was an associate pastor at like a traditional church, kind of medium, 500, 600 people size. And I was at a midweek service up in the AV cockpit in the back. And like a fourth of the people that were normally there on Sundays came on Wednesday night. And of those fourth of the people, at least a fourth of them were literally asleep. And I was sitting there looking at the back of everybody's heads and being able to see who was asleep. And as the senior pastor did his thing up there and preached from the pulpit at 8:00 at night on a Wednesday night. And I thought, I don't think this is accomplishing what we're hoping it would accomplish. Like this doesn't seem to be working. And I appreciate everyone's heart and devotion and dedication, but it's not working. And so that was really for me what began this longing and the search for, is there a different modality for people to actually become like Jesus than the ones that we're currently using? And that's what kind of ushered me into this microchurch sort of direction. And so as you guys experienced your own journey in that and the Lord led you in that, what were some of the friction points, right? I'm sure there are many, right? So maybe just pick the top couple or the one or two that like come to your mind the most. Like what were some of the friction points either that you felt or that you saw other people felt? And was there like an exodus of any kind as you kind of moved into this direction? Did people just say, hey, like this isn't for me, I'm out? And what was that like? How did you handle that, et cetera?
Friction. What's that?
Yes. Well, if people do it the way we did it, they won't have friction, my friend.
Ah, yes, of course. Of course.
Yeah.
This is the polished. This has now become the Polished Church podcast.
Right. I think one of the big things I saw over the course, I don't know that it was necessarily a mass exodus per se, but more what I saw as it seemed like in some ways you were almost messing with people's theology. And that may be like a big statement, a broad statement. But I think so much of what, again, in general, what many church goers come to think about, quote unquote, church is tied to a building, is tied to a traditional line of thinking. And so that's why I say it was almost like we were messing with their theology in a sense of, well, gosh, you sold the building and now you're doing this whole different modality, as you mentioned earlier, of church that I'm just not used to. So in some ways, and that's fair to say then if that was too much for you to swallow, and we know change is hard for all of us, we did see some folks who decided this wasn't for them. I think we saw that a few folks right out the gate say, no, this isn't for us. They needed a lot of information about it. And as you've already heard us say, this was really more of a divine thing that we were processing ourselves. It was almost, it's kind of like that saying where we were building the plane as we were flying it. And then I think you had another group who said, hey, I'm going to stick around for a while. Let's see where this goes. And some of those folks stuck, and some of those folks, after spending a season in micro, said, hey, I still don't think that this is for me or my family. And then I think past that, it might have been one or two here or there. But I don't know at that point that it was necessarily anything to do with the microchurch concept. I think there were just varying reasons. So I would probably kind of categorize that when we talk about like people leaving as part of our journey. I don't know if would you add anything to that?
You didn't build the first class rows the way that people quite wanted them while you were flying the plane. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. One way that's always helpful for me to think about it is I talk to people in terms of like the hotel model versus the Airbnb model a lot. Because one thing I'll tell people is when they're asking like, well, what the heck is that? Especially like church going folks, they're the hardest to explain it to. And usually when they
never lie.
Over, I just kind of stop sometimes because I'm like, okay, I don't God be with you. You go with God. And we have, some of my best friends are leading traditional churches, and I, wish them as much kingdom success as, possible. I mean, we totally support that. In our hearts and financially, we're still on board with helping traditional churches. God can use, all different expressions of the church.
Yeah.
So, but it's easy for me to talk about it when I say, hey, we're becoming the Airbnb of churches in Roanoke. People go, oh, okay, I get what you're saying, kind of. And so some of the friction points were from people who were used to hotels, and then they would come to the Airbnb and go, well, hey, where's the swimming pool? Right. And where's the workout room? And where's the, the free hot breakfast bar? And I would say, well, we don't have that. At least we don't have that yet. And chances are there's, in some ways, we'll never have that because we're not trying to.
And why do I have to wash my own towels?
Do what now?
Why do I have to wash my own towels?
Right. Yeah. What's up with that?
You're supposed to provide me fresh towels every Sunday.
Yeah. We would just say, hey, you know what? There's some things that you miss when you switch to this way of being the church, but you also gain a lot of things. Mm-hmm. But you can't, it's not fair to say that you want to keep both. So you want like this really big, amazing children's ministry with the lights and the, volunteers that have worked 15 hours that week on a skit to get up and, entertain the kids that day. but you also want the authenticity and the intimacy in people's homes. And so it's like, well, you kind of got to pick or choose. And so we had some people who, like, I guess one friction point you could say would be a real practical one would be music. To say, hey, we went away from traditional models. So therefore, we don't have people that are at the church building midweek practicing a worship set and getting it real polished. Instead, we are,
I see what you did there.
Yeah. We're doing something that's more raw and unpolished, really, which I've actually come to love more. It's actually hard for me now to go back into the hotel and not see it a certain way. Like I just am so used to just God's people being God's people without the practice, so to speak, for the program.
Now
So some people left and said, hey, we're going to leave because I really miss the worship. And hey, we're going to leave because we want a bigger children's ministry for our kids.
I agree. And I'm doing my best to be very calculated and even keeled, but it is difficult for me to not recognize that there is a large part of that for many people, not all perhaps, but many people, that is weaned on a consumer mentality of being a follower of Jesus, that it's that me and my dedication to the body of Christ has to do, what is it doing for me? I've heard this phrase that stuck with me long ago, that's what you win them with is what you win them to. And many people were won with this seeker attraction model that was all the whiz bang things. And let me put the 15 PlayStations on the wall for this giant mega church ministry for the kids. And like every kid in the neighborhood is going to want to come to it. Well, yeah, of course they are. But is that necessarily Jesus? Are they getting Jesus, right? And so of course, please grant me that that's perhaps oversimplified and reductionistic. But I do think that there is a component of that consumerism in the hotel, right? That's why hotels were so popular, is because they cater to us and our needs. But the hotel industry is getting slayed by Airbnb in the West, or really probably all over the world. It's getting slayed. And I wonder if this, I do believe with all my heart that God works in all kinds of ways and things and modalities to reach people's hearts. But I just wonder if we are not kind of on the precipice of this massive shift because of all of the other cultural shifts and realities happening in the West, that church is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller, and that the way people are used to experiencing and expressing being the church will be in these smaller modalities. I don't know, but I have a sense that that might be true. So my question is for you guys, if part of the motive and what was the birthing pains of this was to have Jesus formed in people to a greater degree, to see discipleship and disciple making happening, to see unreached, unchristian people being given the opportunities to follow Jesus and surrender to his lordship. Tell me about some of the ways that you've seen this be positive in that direction. What are some of the things that you've seen in this transition and this pursuit into micro? How has it created benefits and successes towards those ends?
John, actually, as you were talking, a testimony that a couple in my microchurch has shared in front of the entire church, but on several occasions came to mind. I've got a couple who came out of a traditional church, and they came to Belmont right, I think, at the point when we had just sold the building. So they were making this, they were coming in fresh and had to make a quick decision about, oh my gosh, they're selling the building. Do we just need to go out the back door today? But they stuck around, and what I'll share is in her testimony, Megan, she describes in the past her going to a larger church, not really having much interaction with the pastor. And even when there was some big event or something ailing her in her life, maybe, a small group leader would show up or minister, but it was rare if ever, that the pastor was coming to her. So funny, she was dealing with something personal at the time, and shared it with my wife. And naturally, as the pastor, I said, well, I'd like to come over to your house and pray for you. And so she shared it was so almost foreign to her that she actually shared that she was nervous about what I was actually going to do while I was there. And so she said she was talking to her husband. Are they going to come and try to do a seance and extract spirits out of me? And is it going to be I don't know, some weird movie that kind of pops out? And she goes on to share that actually it was the complete opposite, that my wife and I came, we ministered to them, prayed with them right there in their home. And for her, being able to have a pastor come hear that need and be there it did wonders for her. And she continues to just share testimonies about the intentionality of microchurch, the transparency, and how you can't slip out the back door. And we are going to be upfront and in each other's space. And she's shared about how her husband has grown more than she's ever seen and is doing more than he's ever done from a spiritual perspective. And that ties, John, back to that original divine kind of conversation that was happening with wanting to have people grow in all that Jesus is calling them to be, and seeing the discipleship play out in a very practical way. So that's one very positive testimony that we share from time to time. And
that's great.
And I think, there's just more and more stories. I've walked with another young guy who, from day one, me coming and meeting John, met this guy, and through Microchurch, he's just exploded and had opportunities to really use his spiritual giftings within Microchurch to facilitate interactive sermons, to use his house as a meeting place for worship. And those things just weren't happening before. And although he was plugged in and he was super involved, I've just seen his spiritual growth go to a whole nother level where he's studying the word. He's almost more engaged at times than I would say myself or Pastor John, just checking in on you, wanted to go to lunch, sending scriptures across. And so those are some of the positive stories, John, that, you can't really put a pin on or a price tag, for lack of a better term. It's been really neat to see.
Yeah, and part of the journey is still kind of in that unlearning phase, because we've been having conversations lately about how to press more into, and actually we're starting a new teaching series next Sunday on 10 weeks, a 10-week series on what it means for us to be missionaries here in our local context, and going a high overview of the book of Acts, and going, what we don't want to do is just be a really small version of big regular church meeting in a house. But, we've made a lot of progress in the way people think about church, the way that they see church, the way that they're willing to participate. So a couple of examples for me would just be raising up folks that are willing to, meet with me, get coached during the week, and be willing to lead a message on Sunday morning. And that would have never happened, in with a pulpit and stage and all that.
Now, let me ask for the audience's sake, let me ask a logistical question. How are you guys currently meeting and expressing? So when you meet on Sundays, what does that look like currently? What's the rhythms like?
I'll jump in and say that the rhythm looks like, actually my microchurch meets on Sunday morning. We actually had started meeting at different times, trying to like, we're not going to meet on Sunday morning because that's what regular churches do. And
regular church.
Yeah, we did like midweek, then we did Sunday evening, and then we're like, we're having troubles. Well, for two reasons. One, because of schedules, but two, because people were not really going, we're taking this so serious that this small expression is your church. And because of how deeply rooted church is in the culture here in the South, it wasn't until we shifted to Sunday morning that some people had the light bulb come on, like, oh, you mean this is actually our church?
Were they like going to other churches at the same time?
Exactly. Yeah. Like well, since we're not doing church on Sunday morning, that frees me up.
Traditional church, but then would have you like as a small group type thing.
Exactly. And we're like, no, we can't have people treated like that because we really want them to see that they are the church in this moment. And so that was a big shift for us for those two reasons.
Another freedom point.
Yeah. Yeah. It was a good thing.
So when you meet in your microchurch, like in a house on a Sunday, are you preaching? And are there other microchurches doing that too?
Yeah, so we, up to this point, we've stayed synchronized on what we're teaching. But for a typical Sunday morning, it looks like this. We show up at 9:00 at someone's home. We hang out for 15 or 20 minutes. And at my place, it kind of becomes like a party, honestly. It's like, it's loud. I like to run larger than a lot of people do for MCs. So like this last Sunday, we had 35 people at our microchurch. And
that's huge.
But it's kind of like, and in a house, it feels like, man, this is hustling and bustling, and we're really pregnant and we're practicing on multiplying and getting ready for that. But it's 15 or 20 minutes of just fun and food and people hanging out. And then we come together and, one of our guys will jump in and give a few like, hey, welcome, glad you're here. Everybody's kind of settling in. Kids are in with. And then we used to not do music because we were so embarrassed by how awful we sang that. And then we moved up to like, all right, we'll just play like a YouTube video.
Yeah.
Along. And then we just said, you know what? We're going to do this like the birthday song. Nobody practices for singing happy birthday at a party. And so we just began to do it like that. And it's really turned into a beautiful, loud, not awesomely sounding, but people just worshiping. And it's just like, you know what? I prefer this now. It's like summer camp, it's versus like Polished church where nobody's singing except for the worship leader. And then we have like a couple of minute breaks where the kids will head on down to the basement. The littles will head on down and they have a lesson for the day. And then we do what we call an interactive message. So I'll be teaching, and the way we talk about it is we kind of like are thinking about building a fence in your backyard. So as the person that's teaching for that day or facilitating, I've decided where the fence posts are, the passage we're studying. We've sent that out ahead of time so people could study on their own. And then we come together, our intro. But depending on the complexity of the passage, we'll spend some time digging into the text and trying to understand what it's trying to say. But then it spreads out into conversation. And that conversational ball is not just going from me to you, then back to me, then to you, then back to me, then to you. It starts going around, where people are passing it to each other. Mm-hmm. And the group has really matured in being able to do that and rightly divide the word on their own. And then when it's time to land the plane, I'll bring it back in, recap what we said. And then I do this every single time I'm leading, is we do what we call, well, up to this point, I've called it the new altar call, where, we're from a Baptist church. So, altar calls were common. But obviously we don't have an altar and we don't call people down. But every single time now I'm just like, hey, the drill here. Over the next 3 or 4 minutes, meet up with 2, maybe 3 at the most people, and answer this question. Like, based on what we studied today, and the question's a little bit different each time, but based on what we studied today, what did the Lord bring to mind for you? And what's one micro commitment that you're going to make this week to carry that out? And we've seen that be really successful because people are actually telling another person, like, and there's no like, do this if you want. It's just become like the norm where people are ready to say something and they share it with somebody. And then there's accountability to follow up on it that week. And then people hang out for another 20, 30 minutes. And,
right.
Sometimes there's a meal, sometimes, a lot of times there's not. And then people head on out and go about their day. So
if you guys,
I think of both of ours.
Yeah. And is there just the 2 currently? Okay. So if you guys had somebody come to you and they had some similar origin story where they were hearing from God that they needed to transition a traditional church into this kind of direction, like what advice would you give them?
Don't do it. Do not.
Yeah. Well, what advice would you give them, right? Like what pitfalls would you tell them to be aware of? Would you tell them that, hey, it's probably not worth it. You might want to just rethink this whole thing. That wasn't the voice of God right there.
I mean, I know we're kind of joking, but honestly, we have said like that probably would be our at least initial response, just kind of tongue in cheek, but because it is probably a much heavier lift than they're anticipating. So I think naturally they're going to say like, well, why are you saying that? You don't want us to do it? Like this hasn't, and it's not that, but just prepping them up front, I think being crystal clear that, yeah, there's going to be probably some larger friction points than maybe you're anticipating. And it isn't necessarily for everyone. But I think some of the advice past that would certainly be to pray some more. And then when you're done praying, get on your knees, get all your leaders and keep praying. But then, it's, I would say, if the Lord is in it and, you feel like this is the direction he's leading you, then go for it. And I would say over communicate. Don't leave anything to chance or reason. I would say double down on ensuring that your leadership at the top is locked arms, and perhaps give them an easy off ramp within that situation, because you can lock arms, and then I think sometimes a leader may get into it and realize, again, maybe at some point this isn't for them, and that can cause an immediate big friction point if they're coming out of what you thought you were locked arms into. But I think in some cases, giving them an off ramp of sorts could help the group as a whole know, okay, in these circumstances, maybe this is a way to get off. So yeah, just over communicate, make sure you're locked arms with your top leadership. I would say also just, you're not gonna know everything. Change, like I said before, change is hard for everyone. Go into it not trying to check every box. I think those of us on this faith journey know that a big component of it is faith, and allowing God to shape and challenge and help you to unlearn some things in the process so that he can input what he needs out of you, the leadership, the church, to go into the community. Would you add anything to that?
Sure. I would, it would depend on like how big of a following they maybe already have, if they're a pastor of a large, medium, small size church, or if they're a regular guy on the street starting something from scratch. I would say I wouldn't quickly convert an existing church into this just because I think it's the sexy new model and that it's, something cool to do.
But those are definitely the wrong reasons.
Yeah, I would definitely not want that, because it might wind up doing more damage than good, especially if they're not wired to be in it for the long haul and to be faithful through all the pain and suffering that's going to happen and the disappointments, because that model's it's not going to change the fact that people are people, right? And you're going to have disappointments and letdowns, and the model's not going to make people be more spiritual. And it's not going to fix all your problems. In fact, it's going to give you a whole different set of problems. Mm-hmm. So be ready for that, another 5 or 10 years of a lot of learning. So and it would depend maybe on their specific circumstances.
That's good
for that. So, and I would also say, who do you have around you that's on board with you right now? Because if you're like a lone wolf out there and you're thinking about doing this, then that's a wrong thing to jump into without, the slow build. And, the Lord usually would, groom his servants for a long time, like Moses out in the wilderness, getting them ready, preparing their hearts. So.
Yeah, I know when I was first venturing into this direction, everything I could find told me, don't do it. Don't try to transition an existing church. Mm-hmm. Everybody that I was learning from, hearing from, everybody that had written on it had all started something from scratch. Mm-hmm. And what they did was take a small group of leaders. Most of them were typically young. And they just said, let's go out on our own and try something. And it would, and here I am reading about them 15, 20, 30, 40 years later or whatever. But I couldn't find anything on traditional churches transitioning as a whole into these kinds of things. They were always birthed as kind of a new expression. Mm-hmm. And we took like a year to pray and fast as a congregational community to decide and discern if this is like where God was leading us. And we, discerned and decided that, God was calling us to try to transition an existing church. And now some 5 years or so later, I understand what all those guys were saying back then. It's a whole different thing. And there's just not that many out there currently. I think there will be more and more though. And that's why I keep asking these questions of people who are in that particular field and in that particular, harvest of just, what does it look like? Because I think one of the pieces that exists that's so prominent, especially in the beginning, for the first several years at least, is like you said, John, it's all the unlearning. There is a boatload of deconstruction that has to happen to transition a traditional church into something like this that isn't there nearly to the degree when you have a smaller group of people starting out from scratch that are already kind of bought into the vision. Whatever deconstruction is needed has kind of already taken place. Mm-hmm. And I think that for me, going through this process, I'm really grateful for the people that God put around me and the team of people that were a part of all of this, because they helped, I think, pace the change differently than I would have paced it if they weren't there. And it's gone much, much slower than I would want it to go. And COVID definitely threw like a little speed bump in the road too. But I literally thought like a year, 2 years, and like, we're going to have this thing pivoted, because I was already in a smaller church expression. I wasn't like in a giant mega church or anything. It was already a small church. And I'm like, oh, this shouldn't be. And we're 5 years in, and I feel like we're just starting to get to the end of the deconstruction process. And like now actually venturing into true missional microchurch paradigms, right? Like that's how I'm feeling right now. Like, I think we're just now starting to like be ready to do microchurches. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. But yeah. And to like, I think for me, part of it is like to feel okay about that.
Yeah.
That like, that's okay. Like that's the Lord's work, and we discerned that was what God was calling us to be faithful in, is to be faithful to the people that he had with us. And we did our very best with that. But there's something in me too, that is also like, oh man, I just wish we could have this would have been simpler or easier. And like you said, John, I mean, that's a little bit of a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Like that's not really true. Like if we had started differently, then we would have just had a different set of problems, And so I really appreciate that call to mind. So as we get ready to land this plane, like, is there anything else that's on your mind that you would want to be able to offer to the audience or to somebody listening, whether they're a church pastor, they're on staff, or they're just a part of a church? Maybe they're a small group leader, or maybe, I think the demographic of Unpolished, right, is anybody that is sensing, I think kind of similar to all of us, that there's just something not quite right with their current church landscape, their current church experience, that there's some longing that like Jesus is maybe kind of calling and beckoning them to something more, but they don't really know what that is or what that looks like, or it's just this weird kind of splinter in their mind and heart. Like, to that person, is there anything else that you would want to say?
I guess I would want to say something to that family out there who left their traditional church 6 months ago, a year ago, and they haven't been attending church anywhere because they got hurt because, there was just something not right, and they did leave and they never settled back in anywhere.
That's good.
I think
that's a growing number of people.
Yeah, I would say that from our experience, that's actually a good time frame. Like, we've had people that have gone straight from traditional church to try out the Airbnb have not stuck as well as people that have had a window of letting some of that hurt go, or that, those expectations that even if they were mad at or upset about what they saw at church, they somehow still wanted that at the next place. So I would just say to that family or that person that's out there is, now's the time to humbly walk into a place like that and be okay with it being unpolished and not professional, and not to critique it like you would a restaurant, that you wouldn't leave and have your list of 5 things that they should have done better, like greet you at the door with a bulletin or, anything like that. But just to say, let me just show up and see what God will do, and be ready to receive, and be willing to receive and see a different way of being the church. And I think that for me, I would just want to give them a push in that direction. That either they need to be a part of starting something like that, or find something near you and go and help and participate.
Yes, that's a beautiful way to end just this idea, this beckon, this call to participate with Jesus in his work of recreating and newly creating the world around us and in us. John and Wes, what a beautiful pleasure it has been for me to be with you guys.
Hey, man,
we love you, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thanks.
All right.
Cool,
Thanks
brother.
so much.
Have a great day, man.